Hey everybody, this is Ben with Empire's Comics here in Sacramento, California. And as you guys know, we do our Google Hangout interviews. We have quite a few interviews that we do in the shop with the guests that come through, but when we can't get someone into the shop necessarily, we bring them down here to the Google Hangout interviews. And tonight we have a very special guest. We have Mr. Jason Aaron joining us all the way from halfway across the country.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great tonight, Jason. Thank you. And thank you very much for coming down, taking some time out of your schedule and joining us, especially since it's a little later over there than it is here. But are you a night owl? Do you write at night?
Yeah, I'm a total night owl. It works out good because of my wife's like she gets up like a farmer for some reason. She's early to rise, so she gets up and gets our kid off to school, and I can sleep late and then stay up to the wee hours. I think that's when I do my best writing is in the middle of the night.
And now, is there something about that? Is that the way it's always been for you, or is it just you find that it's free of distractions, then and it gives you a better time to write?
Yeah, both. I mean, I have always been like that. I think I'm wired like that. You know, I was late. I would always be late to middle school and high school. When I had day jobs, I was pretty much always late for those. So anything that required me to get up early in the morning, I was not going to be on time for. And actually, one of the last day jobs I had when I was in Alabama before I moved to Kansas City, I was a cook in a bar, and I worked like midnight to, the morning. So I was the all night, late night cook, like making burgers and quesadillas for people at 4 o'clock in the morning. So one time, Oysters Rockefeller. Who orders Oysters Rockefeller at 4 a.m. in a bar? I don't know, but somebody did. But I loved it. I loved the drive home, like as everybody else was driving to work. Thought that was awesome.
Okay, so just completely opposite hours. Well, then this works out perfect with
Right.
the comic book industry because not only do you have to not be necessarily where their offices are, but you can keep your own hours as long as you turn everything else in. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
So how long have you wanted to be a comic book creator? Because, I mean, a lot of us growing up with comic books, one of the first things we say is we want to be one. But when was it that you knew you wanted to do this for a living?
Since I was a kid. I mean, I remember telling my dad when I was really young. I don't remember how young, that that's what I wanted to do. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea how many people had that job, where those people were, how you went about getting one of those jobs. Even by the time I was, 25, I didn't have the answers to those questions. I mean, I knew they were in New York. I figured, well, I just needed to live there. So pretty much all my life, I knew I wanted to write. I read comics the whole time. My mom bought me comics, before I was old enough to read. And I never stopped reading them. I never had one of those phases where I got out of them and got back in. I've been reading comics the whole time. I've had a pull list, one place or another, for over 30 years now. So it's what I've always wanted to do. It just took me till it's 30, before I was able to really start doing it.
So what changed at age 30 then? Because I assume you were just working the jobs, going to school, doing the normal stuff. But at 30, what was it that got you into the industry?
Well, yeah, I went to college and got an English degree and did a lot of writing. I had sold a couple of short stories, or the first time I ever got paid to write something. And when I moved to Kansas City, I started doing film reviews, which I like because I got to see free movies and I got free DVDs. But my break with Comic Wise came in 2000, summer of 2001. Yeah, when I won a Marvel Comics talent search contest, which was a weird thing because Marvel had never really done something like that before for writers. Mark Bagley broke in with that Marvel tryout book years and years ago. This was a contest that was different, and they were looking for writers and artists. So people turned in submissions at Wizard World Chicago and at San Diego. So I showed up at Wizard World Chicago and dropped a one-page pitch for a Wolverine story on a big stack of other ones. and didn't hear anything about it for months and months, to the point where I mentioned it to one of my friends, like, what, hey, whatever happened with that contest? And he said, oh, I think somebody else won. I think they already announced that. And I was like, oh crap, I guess I didn't win that. And then I was at work one day, and I had a message on my phone from Mike Martz at Marvel. And literally my first thought was like, wow, it's really crappy of him to call to tell me I didn't win. Like, what a jerk. But then I did win. I got to do this 8-page Wolverine story that came out in 2002, I think. So that kind of got my foot in the door.
So two things then. That 8-page story, was that based on the 1-page synopsis that you had given him?
Yeah. Yeah, it was me ripping off Flannery O'Connor, basically. Or it was me doing a Wolverine version of her story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It's this weird encounter between Wolverine and this woman who has a flat tire in the middle of the woods, and it's mostly them talking about issues of fate and such. Before, of course, the claws have to come out at the end of it. So I think Mike told me at the time that I was one of the only people who didn't have a story that was set in a bar or involved ninjas. So I instantly, made the first cut.
Rose to the top of the stack.
Right.
Now, then my second question is, you said you didn't know if Marvel had ever done this prior to you winning the writers contest. Do you know if they've ever done this afterwards? Because I don't recall seeing it.
No, that's what, like I said, it was weird in that it was a one-time thing. I guess I ruined it for everybody else, so I'm sorry about that. I don't know what the story. I should ask Joe or somebody, like, what's the, why, that was kind of in the Jimis days when they were trying a lot of, Bill Jimis would, try anything. They'd try a lot of different things. Right after that, after I won that talent search contest, I started pitching all sorts of stuff to Marvel. I was pitched the origin of the Punisher story. And I remember the editor said, well, that's a great idea, but Garth Ennis is already doing it. I was like, dang it. I pitched a lot of stuff. And I pitched to, remember they were going to do a relaunch of Epic, where they were looking for pretty much anything. They said all the different genres. So I wrote a pitch for a relaunch of the Nom and sent it in. You had to write the first script to submit. So I wrote the first issue of the Nom #1, sent it in, got a letter back that they considered it, but they passed on it due to content or something. I don't know exactly what that meant, if it was too mature or whatever. But that was the other side #1, basically. That was what was ultimately the first full book I'd have published.
Which you then took over to Vertigo.
Right.
And actually is now available on hardcover. It just came out, a month or so ago?
That's right, yeah.
So it's back in print for everyone who has not read it. It stands out on the shelf, too, because it's got a bright red cover. So what was it like working over at Vertigo then? Because, I mean, this was a creator-owned property. This was technically your first creator-owned property, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was, my first creator-owned thing. That first issue was the first 22-page comic script I'd ever written. I'd only written that one 8-page Wolverine story was all I'd done before the other side #1. And I sent it to Will Dennis at Vertigo, and he turned me down 2 or 3 times because he said nobody buys war books. Even ones Garth Ennis does don't really sell that great, and nobody knows who you are. So he said no thanks. But I said, well, I wrote the script. Would you let's take a look at it at least? And then I did. I think one of the secrets to breaking in is that I was persistent with him, but I didn't bother him. I didn't pester him, because I sent him that script. He said, yeah, I'll take a look at it. Still can't use it. Turned me down again, but I'll take a look at it. So, and it was months later before he had read it and got back to me. And I would email him maybe once a month or so, and just like hey, still alive. I'm still here. But I wasn't emailing him every week like, hey, did you read that script? Did you read it yet? Did you read it now? I just kind of, stayed in touch, but didn't bug him. And eventually he read it and he's like, yeah, we want to do this.
Wow. Okay. I mean, there is obviously a fine line on persistence versus being an annoyance, but
Right.
all it took was for him to literally sit down and read that, and then it was enough for him to say, "Let's go ahead and do this miniseries."
Yep. I mean, it was all Will. Vertigo, I think technically at the time, I don't know about now, but at the time they didn't take unsolicited submissions. But I mean, that's totally what I did. I just sent it to him out of the blue because he'd been the editor on those Garth Ennis war stories that I loved, and a lot of books I loved at Vertigo. That was the other thing I kind of figured out in that period between winning the talent search contest and when the other side #1 came out, which was about 5 years. So it's 5 years where I didn't have another book published. I was working that whole time. I was writing. I was pitching things. I quickly figured out I was wasting my time just first I was just pitching to whoever I could get an email address for, right? Like whoever, and if they would reply to me, oh, it was on. Well, I'd pitch them some more. But I quickly figured out I needed to be smart about it, and so I just targeted a couple of editors. It was Will Dennis and Axel Alonso. Axel had been at Vertigo and then moved to Marvel, and Will had taken over a lot of Axel's books. So those were the two. If I looked at all the books I was reading at the time, those guys edited a lot of them. So I kind of thought, well, if I'm going to break in, I need to find somebody who's got similar sensibilities to me, and chances are these two guys do. So I targeted them. I started sending stuff to them, and I mean that worked because those two guys, gave me my career in comics. That was the bulk of the stuff I was doing for the first decade of my career in comics was because of those two guys.
That's awesome. And I mean, when he let you do the other side, it was initially received very well, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably the lowest selling book I've ever done. Because again, it was a war book by some, guy who'd written an 8-page Wolverine story. Cameron Stewart drew it, so it's gorgeous. And he was just coming off working with Grant Morrison, which blew my mind because I'm the world's biggest Grant Morrison fan. So the idea that he was going from working with Grant to working with me, I thought that was ridiculous. So yeah, it was very well received at the time. It just didn't sell great, but is the most important book I've ever done. And that without that, I don't get Scalped. Without Scalped, I don't get all this stuff at Marvel that came after it.
So then let's move on to Scalped real quick, because the Scalped was honestly the first thing I ever read of yours. That's what caught my attention. And Scalped it's a book that I don't think I've seen anything like on the shelves, because we're dealing with an Indian reservation, the politics behind it, drug running, an undercover agent. Where does the inspiration for that come from?
I mean, it came, really from working with Will Dennis on the other side. I think I'd written the first 2 issues of that maybe. And at that point he said, hey, do you want to pitch me some more stuff? And I said, absolutely. So I sent him about 4 or 5 pitches. There was a zombie book. There was a Bible story, which is what eventually became The Goddamned, my other new current or ongoing Image book. And then there was one called Scalped, or I think maybe it was originally called Scalp Hunter, because there was an old DC Western character called Scalp Hunter appeared in Weird Western Tales, the Jonah Hex book. So initially my pitch was kind of like part Western, part present day, and it involved Scalp Hunter and then like a descendant of his in the present. And Will was like, well, let's clean that up and just make it a present day thing. But he and I were both big crime fans. We talked a lot about crime genre stuff. We both loved Michael Mann's Crime Story TV show, which was sort of the story of one cop chasing one criminal as he's on the path of ascendancy. And we talked a lot about State of Grace, the Phil Joannou movie with Sean Penn and Gary Oldman, about a guy who goes undercover as himself in his old hometown in Boston among a bunch of Irish gangsters. So those things kind of combine. I was already interested in Native American history and um, especially the stuff from the 70s, the Leonard Peltier case, the American Indian movement, all that stuff. So I was already kind of interested in that, and that seemed like a setting I hadn't seen before, especially for a story like this. So it all just kind of clicked. But again, it took a lot of work to kind of get from that original idea to what ultimately came out. That was me and Will going back and forth a lot. And having to convince Karen Berger to sign off on it. I think she wasn't sold on it for a bit, and literally at some point I wrote a document that was 25 reasons you should publish Scalped. That was just for Karen, and that was one of the things that got her to sign off on it.
Okay, and she was, because of those reasons, she was willing to let you have a chance on this, and it worked out well. Obviously, I mean, how many issues did Scalp go?
60 something or 60.
Okay, now is that a world that you
60s.
would imagine yourself ever going back to, or is it just done?
The world of Scalped?
Yeah.
I've said for the longest time no. I started thinking about it a little bit just when I was on the set of the TV of the pilot. I thought like, well, there's some stories we never got to, like we could do. They would all be flashbacks. They would not be the. I wouldn't take anything past the ending point where we left those characters. I wouldn't go beyond that. But there were stories from the past that we had talked about doing that we didn't have room for. I thought we could do something like that if we ever wanted to, but I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, it's no. It's not a thing I'm going back to. But I have
If
thought
something
about
hits
it.
you, you'll do it. I mean, it's open. You could, but as of now, no plans whatsoever.
Right.
Okay, well that's all right. We've got plenty of other books coming out for you. So from there, being over at Vertigo, what was it? Was it just because of Axel that you made the jump back to Marvel and began working on so many different properties over there?
Yeah. It was totally because of Axel. I mean, again, I was pitching stuff or sending stuff to Will, and then I started doing stuff with Will, so I sent in all that stuff to Axel. So then Axel called me out of the blue and one day and offered me a Wolverine story. Now he tells me he voted for me back in the talent search, back when I won the contest. He said he voted. I don't know if I believe that or not, but he claims that. But yeah, I sent him the other side when it came out, sent him Scalped, and then he offered me a Wolverine one shot. He gave me this setup of Wolverine is trapped in the pit, and this guy's shooting him constantly with a machine gun, and how does he get out? He just gave me the challenge of figure it out, write a story based on that. So I did. I wrote. It's called The Man in the Pit, and Howard Chaykin drew it.
Nice.
That was my first. That was my first full, story at Marvel.
And I mean, from there, you've worked on so many different things. I mean, you got Punisher stuff under your belt. You got Ghost Rider. I mean, now you have Doctor Strange. Of course, you got Thor. So Marvel has, I mean, really become kind of your home.
Yeah. I mean, I was still at DC for the longest time because I was doing Scalped. I did the only DCU thing I ever did was with Mike Martz, the guy who had picked me to win the talent search contest at Marvel. Then he ended up at DC doing Batman stuff. So I did when they did those Joker's Asylum one shots, these one shots focusing on different Batman villains. I did a Penguin one for him, which was a blast. It was with Jason Pearson. It's the only time I've gotten to write Batman. Batman was in one panel. So yeah, I was still at DC, but Marvel was the first one to offer me an exclusive. Axel was the first guy to offer me an ongoing book. They offered me Ghost Rider. So yeah, and I've been exclusive at Marvel ever since. I continued Scalped, got to run its course, and when we wanted it to end, but I've yeah, Marvel's been my home for almost my entire career.
So are you still in an exclusive with Marvel?
Yep, yeah. I mean, I've always been exclusive. I've always re-signed since that very first one. So yeah,
So
I've got
then, even with the exclusive contract with Marvel, I mean, obviously you have your independent properties. Are you allowed to do a certain amount outside of Marvel, or is it just not with DC?
right. Pretty yeah. I mean, I'm a creator on stuff. I can kind of do what I want. Um, I just can't go write Batman and Superman. So yeah, it's pretty much or any other work for hire stuff.
Then, before we get back, I want to talk a little more about your Marvel stuff and, of course, your independent stuff. But I mean, obviously, right now you've got a great position over at Marvel. You're writing one of the most memorable runs on Thor. Um, would you, at some point, like to say, "Hey, I want to go write Batman"? Is there any DC characters that have been bugging you to do?
Sure. You're gonna get me in trouble? Is that what you're trying to do? Um, no, I mean, I've always said I was a DC kid. I mean, you can like that spinner rack right behind me has comics on it that I bought off the spinner rack when I was a kid, and there's a lot of DC stuff on there. There's a lot of New Teen Titans, Swamp Thing, Atari Force, Blue Devil. Those are the books that kind of got me hooked in the first place. That made me keep coming back week after week, and buying comics. So yeah, I grew up as more of a DC kid. For me as a creator, I mean, I kind of separate the stuff I'm a fan of and what I do for a living, if that makes any sense. And that I've never chased jobs based on the characters I liked reading growing up. I've always, it's more about kind of what's right at that time. Who am I working with? What's the setup? Not just like, oh, I love Batman. I've got more Batman comics than I've got anything else, which is true. I read Batman since I was a kid, but it's not me. You just walk in saying, I've got this briefcase full of Batman pitches and I just have to write Batman. I've never been like that. I was not the world's biggest Thor fan growing up. I love the Simonson stuff. I think I've got one of those right back there. Um, but I wasn't a huge Thor fan. It was just when that book was kind of available, it struck me as that's what I want to do right now, and I came up with a good idea at the time. So I've always kind of separated that. Um, but that said, yeah, I mean, someday who knows? I mean, I am very, very happy at Marvel. They treat me very well. I'm very happy with the stuff I'm doing. Thrilled about the stuff I've got coming up. Um, so if we're talking about me going to DC, that's somewhere down the line. If I was, yeah, I mean, I'd love to write Batman, sure. More than that, I'd probably love to write Superman. I feel like there's some part of me I think that will always feel like you're not a real comic book writer until you've written Superman. Um, you're not a real superhero writer. Um, so someday, I also love Hawkman. I think Hawkman's. I'm glad to see there's a bunch of Hawkman stuff in the Scott Snyder Metal book because I feel like Hawkman's kind of gotten the shaft for a while. I think that's a great character.
Yeah, it's one of those guys that pops up for a while. You'll get a good long or a good run, and then he just disappears again.
Right.
So,
So
well,
yeah, someday. Who
someday,
knows?
someday you'll do it. And with Superman, the neat thing I think about him is, as iconic as he is, I think Superman is probably the hardest character to write and write a really good story with, just because, a lot of people fall back on he gets hit, he falls down, he's back up. But then when you get a story like All Star Superman, where he just is kind of the focus and the science fiction story around him is the story, I think those kind of things really set people aside as writers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and All Star Superman is one of my favorite comics ever. That book is way up on the pedestal for me. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think the fact that I think you're absolutely right. It is a challenge. That's kind of it's one of the things that attracts me. Um, like I think again, kind of going beyond just being a fan of stuff, I've been attracted over the course of my career to something that's different, something that's a challenge, something that allows me to flex muscles I haven't flexed before creatively. Um, so I think Superman would fit that bill. I think
Okay.
a lot of the stuff. I think Thor, when I took Thor, that was an example of that. I think the other stuff I've got coming up is an example of that.
So when you took Thor over, one of the things that I found fascinating about it, and I think is probably one of the reasons that it was so successful, is immediately you took Thor out of the superhero world. All of a sudden, we were dealing with a god, and then I think you had one issue where we went back to Earth just to show he was still part of it. But I thought that was really neat. I mean, you really kind of went full throttle into the god aspect as opposed to the superhero.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's what sets Thor apart, right? That's what makes Thor different than Captain America or Spider-Man or all the other heroes around the Marvel U. I mean, that's what Stan talks about when he talks about they came up with the idea of Thor is what do we do that's different than all the this other stuff we've done, and the idea of doing a super god um, was what set him apart. So in the movies are the movies, and in the movies they lean a little more towards the Asgardians being kind of aliens who live a long time and are perceived by us as gods. I went the opposite direction. I very much leaned into no, he's a god. The first book I did was called Thor: God of Thunder for a reason. The first storyline is called The God Butcher, followed by The God Bomb. In the very first issue, Thor answers a little girl's prayer. So I was, hitting that nail over the head really, really hard, and that we're leaning into the God part of it, because that's what I find interesting, and the idea of the themes I set up in that first arc, I'm still dealing with today. Now, what, 5 years later, however long it's been, the idea of what does it mean to be a god in the Marvel universe? What does it mean to be a good god? What does it mean to be worthy? Those are questions that will run through my entire run, however long that is.
So you're on Thor for the foreseeable future then.
Yes.
Okay, and
Yes.
I mean, obviously, for everyone watching this, I'm sure you guys know that Jane Foster is. Spoiler alert: Jane Foster is now Thor has taken on the mantle after the effects of original sin, where three little words were whispered to the Odin son, and things changed drastically. I have a quick question here. Did you know what those three words were going to be before that came out?
I did. They were
Okay,
written.
we have debates around here, and I was convinced you just said three words because I can make something up later.
I'm not going to show you what it says in my Thor notebook, but this is my Thor notebook, which is filled with notes from when I first took over. Somewhere in here, there's a page that's about what Fury said. So I did have a few different ideas of what they were. I can't find it now. It's in there somewhere. A few different ideas about what it was, kind of all revolving around that same idea and same theme. So yes, I don't like setting up a mystery if I don't know the answer to it. I don't like putting a character in a situation if I don't know how they're going to get out of it. I don't like writing myself in the corners like that. So when I start something, I always have at least an idea of how it's going to end or where it's going. Even if that idea changes or morphs along the way, I still know something about where it's leading.
Okay, that general destination is going to be the same. Maybe just the path getting there is going to be a little bit different.
Right.
Okay, so then when Jane took over, I mean, there was a lot of people who were happy. There were a lot of people who were mad. I hear both in the shop. I think that Jane Foster has been a great addition because one of the things that I like about it, and for all of you who haven't read it, you just like to complain about it. One of the things that's neat about Jane is when she speaks Asgardian, but when you see her thought bubbles, it's much more Midgard.
Right. Yeah. We kind of established that right out of the gate in issue 2. Right after she first appeared. I mean, the whole idea is if we're going to change who's holding the hammer, on the one hand, the book doesn't change. The idea of a Thor story doesn't change. In my mind, I've been telling the same story that whole time. Um, to me, if you go see a Thor movie and you go pick up the comic and it's a man in the movie and it's a woman in the book, it's still this. I think to me, that shouldn't be a huge, that they're not two different things, right? It's not apples and oranges. It's still a Thor story. That said, everything shouldn't be exactly the same. Um, how she acts in that role, her relationship with the hammer, those things are very different than Thor Odinson his experience.
And oh, sorry.
So yeah, I mean that was what you're saying was a part of that. The idea of, and again, also in the beginning we were playing with the mystery of who she was. You didn't know right away that it was Jane Foster. Um, so that was also part of that too. Is this idea of, her thoughts sound different than her voice. Um, also playing with the transformative power of that hammer, which again is the thing that to me makes it a fundamentally Thor story, is that idea goes back to the very first appearance of Thor, back in 1963. That first story, the opening of that first story is this doctor Donald Blake who's walking with a cane, hobbles into this cave, finds a stick, whacks it. The stick turns into a hammer. The hammer transforms him into Thor, because it has that inscription on it. Whosoever is worthy of this shall possess the power of Thor, and he's transformed. So that that kind of that status quo got changed as the book went along, and you eventually find out, well, Donald Blake was Thor all along, and Thor was sent to Earth by his dad as punishment, and blah blah blah. But still, that very first story, that enchantment, that inscription, that promise of transformation was a fundamental part of it. It wasn't a big part of it until Walt Simonson came along and had somebody else come along and pick up the hammer and be transformed by it. But that's been a recurring thing. So what we've done with Jane, in my mind, is a bigger version of that. And that we've seen somebody, for the first time, somebody different come along. And, well, no, not the first time, because you had Eric Masterson, right?
That's right.
This is still the same sort of thing. Somebody comes along, picks up the hammer, is transformed by it, becomes Thor, takes the mantle of Thor. But to me, again, that's a fundamental part of the character of what made Thor different from all the other characters across the Marvel U.
Now, how hard was it to get Marvel to make a change like that? I mean, a lot of times comic companies like the status quo. They want to make sure that everybody who reads it knows the character, isn't going to be upset. But I mean, it was a pretty drastic change.
Not at all. Not at all. Again, I've been working, even by that point, I've been working at Marvel for quite a while. I've been on Thor for a couple of years by that point. And it was kind of part of the zeitgeist, of mixing things up and changing some of our characters around. You can see, that's happened a lot. That's happened a lot across the Marvel U, and some people are pro, some people are con in terms of that, in terms of changing so many characters at once. It was never a premeditated thing. We never had a retreat where we're like here's the list and we're going to change all these characters to somebody else. It kind of just started happening story by story. But no, there was never any resistance. There was never anything but Marvel being gung-ho and being down with it from the get-go.
Okay. Now, I've only been a Thor fan off and on through the years. It's not been one of my absolute passions. But when I read 700 and I realized that you had been on there for 60 plus issues, out of 700 issues, that's pretty impressive. And one of the things that, I mean, since you're changing a lot, one of the things that I wanted to know is if this had been something that they had talked about previously, or if it was all you, with the changing of Mjolnir to more of an actual personality.
No, that was me. I mean, again, it kind of came from when we had Jane pick up the hammer. I wanted to change that relationship, and also, I mean, I kind of had the plan all along. Again, in my notebook here, there's a couple pages that are the origin of the hammer. So I always kind of had the idea of getting to that story at some point, and making the hammer seem a little bit more sentient. Um, and so that was kind of part of just, again, giving her a very different relationship with it.
Okay, well, we have a question from Amanda. She wants to know, why doesn't Jane just stay Jane? Because we seem to only see her going back to get chemo treatments. Why not just stay in the Thor persona?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, Mark Wade was the first one to ask me that question at one of our retreats. Um, and it's true. Like, presumably she could just stay Thor, right? And as long as she didn't go back into Jane, she wouldn't die of cancer. And we've kind of addressed that in the book before a couple times. Part of it has been, Jane doesn't want to let go of her human identity. That Jane Foster has been playing an important role in things as we've gone along too. She was a senator in the Congress of Worlds. She was one of the only voices trying to stop this Malekith War of the Realms that's spreading from realm to realm. Well, Asgard's kind of turning a blind eye. Jane's been one of the people trying to get Asgard to intervene to help these other realms. So she felt like she had an important role to play there as Jane in a way she couldn't as Thor. Um, that said, that's still a question we have not definitively answered. There's still always the chance of, yeah, maybe she could just stay as Thor. I will say we will definitively answer that question in the current arc.
Okay, yeah, the current arc things are not looking too good for Jane, as a matter of fact.
Well, it's called the death of Thor, so no, that tells you right away things aren't looking good, which is, not a surprise if you've been reading the book, right? Like, she's been dealing with cancer now for a couple of years. That's been an ongoing part of the story. And I've always said that's, we're not going to magic that away. We're not going to give that we're not going to cheat. That's not going to be a cheap cheat in order to get out of that. So take from that what you will.
All right. Okay. Well, you're here for the definitive future, so we'll be along for the ride.
And then as Thor, she's also got the man god to deal with. So
we've got a couple more questions. So let's see. Somebody, Adam wants to know what's the favorite book you've worked on? Who's your favorite character, and favorite current comic book writer?
Well, those are a lot of questions.
They are. I think we already hit the character. Is it Batman?
No, I mean, my all-time favorite character, I don't know. I mean, I love the Fantastic Four. And in particular, I love Ben Grimm. So I'd probably say The Thing. In terms of my favorite book I've ever done, was that the question?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, that's a little like asking me who my favorite child is, right? I mean, they all feel like my children in a way, and I mean that honestly, and that I feel just as invested when I'm writing Thor as I do when I'm writing Southern Bastards or something that I came up with myself. So I don't ever like to choose. I mean, like I said, The Other Side is maybe the most important book I've ever done, and that was kind of the first one. Scalped was the first big thing I've ever done. I think that's the book where I hopefully figured out kind of how to do this and how to write and how to tell a long story like that. And that's the book that kind of got me, helped get me everything at Marvel. So I don't know. I don't know how to pick a favorite one. I mean, for me, honestly, seriously, as a writer, I'm always most excited, most invested in what I'm doing this week. So this week I'm writing Southern Bastards, so I'll say Southern Bastards.
Okay. Well, we're saving that one for last, by the way. We're going to get to that pretty soon here. Because I really want to talk to you about Southern Bastards. I'm interested to hear some things.
Wait, and then the last question was, who's my favorite comic book writer?
Yes.
Of all time or right now?
That you enjoy reading on the shelves, I believe you said. That you enjoy reading currently going on. I mean, we already said that Grant's on the list.
Right. Grant's my all-time favorite comic book writer. But Grant doesn't have a lot of stuff on the shelves right now. So I'd probably say Donny Cates. I think Donny Cates is really hot right now. His image stuff has been really cool. I liked God Country. I really like Rednecks. His Marvel stuff hasn't started coming out yet. He's doing Doctor Strange, and I read the first issue of that the other day, and it's really great. And then I've heard his pitch for Thanos. I haven't seen an issue yet, but that's coming out soon too, and that sounds insane. So I'm really excited to see the stuff he's got coming out at Marvel.
Okay, and one more question. He says, "Is Iron Fist in the Marvel Legacy one-shot Shao Lao the Undying?"
You mean the prehistoric Iron Fist?
I believe so.
Well, I'll just say we don't know anything about those characters just yet. We glimpsed those prehistoric heroes just in the opening of the Marvel Legacy one shot. I've said, a lot of places that's the beginning of something. That's the beginning of what I'll be doing for Marvel. The big thing I'll be doing for Marvel come next year. Something I'm already working on. So there is a next chapter to the story of those characters. We will see those characters a lot more, and we will, as that goes along, learn a lot more about each one of them. Each one of them in the past, and how those kind of most ultimate of legacy characters, how that continues to affect our present day in the Marvel universe. So to be continued, I guess, is the simple answer.
We'll leave it at that. I think we spent enough time on the actual Marvel universe, except for one more question. Is there anything coming up that you're going to be doing that you can tell us about? Any new titles? Anything exciting?
No.
Well, but there is something.
Yes, I mean I can talk about Thor.
All right.
Again, 700 just came out, like you said, which was, I think, really like it's one of the books I'm the most proud of. If for no other reason, the amazing lineup of artists you had in that one comic, it was kind of ridiculous. Just a wealth of beautiful art in that book. So coming next, we get 701, which picks up right from the end of 700. It's drawn by James Herron, who drew a little bit of 700. He was initially supposed to just draw basically the same story in 700, and then we were able to get a few more pages out of him. And so he's drawing all of 701, which is awesome. James, a guy I've wanted to work with for a long time. And then after that, Russell Dauterman is back for the rest of that arc. That's our legacy arc. It's called The Death of Thor. I've said it's a Thor story I've been wanting to write for years. It's one I've had in my head for a long time. This is kind of where things have been heading for a while. And I'm almost done writing it. I'm also getting ahead for the first time in what seems like forever, which is a terrific, terrific feeling. So I've been able to, probably for the first time since I've been writing Thor, I've been able to sit down and write multiple issues of Thor in a row, which is a great feeling. So yeah, that's and I'll stay on Thor. That's the plan. This is Thor's the kind of the first time I feel like in my career where I was able to, coming into that book, I just kind of put down roots. I felt comfortable enough and confident enough at that point where I was like, well, this is mine now, and I'm not going to leave until I'm done. And of course, if the sales tank, Marvel is going to say, like, you're out of here, we're bringing somebody else in. But as long as people have continued to buy the book and the response has been good, and first time I was like you're gonna have to pry this one out of my cold dead hands. Like I'm gonna lay some big tracks. I'm gonna tell a long story, which it's harder to do these days because even the course of my Thor run, it's been like 4 or 5 different Thor books, right? Like God of Thunder and Thor and Thors and Mighty Thor, and so you always have to kind of roll with those punches. But I really wanted to grab a hold of that corner of the Marvel universe and have that be mine for a while. So I'm still not done yet. As for what else I'll be doing next year, I can't say other than if you read Marvel Legacy, um, it's the next part of that story.
Okay, that's fair enough. We'll leave it at that. Before we go on to your independent stuff, though, I don't think there's any way we can't at least acknowledge the fact that you're writing the Star Wars books, which is extremely important now because not only does Disney own Marvel, but they own Lucas, which means everything that's in the comic books is canon as well. That must have been pretty exciting.
Oh yeah, that was a huge thrill. You know, I mean, again, I worked with Marvel for a while because so you kind of get used to writing the characters that you read as a kid. You know, it's so exciting the first time you get a paycheck and it's got Spider-Man on it. I remember that moment. I remember the first time I got to write dialogue for Spider-Man. That was a huge thrill. But I've been kind of doing that for a while, and you kind of get used to it. When Star Wars kind of came out of the blue, it was like being brand new again. Uh, Literally, I sit down right here to write that first issue. I put the John Williams score on. I thought this is my one
That's
chance to write
awesome.
Star Wars #1. We came at the perfect time. It was the beginning of that year as everything was building up towards the first of the new films. We were kind of the first new Star Wars thing out of the gate. Star Wars coming back to Marvel. It was a very exciting time to be doing all that. So I didn't want to mess it up. I put the theme on, sat down, and yeah, putting words in the mouth of Han Solo for the very first time was a huge thrill. And that really never got old. I mean, I did 37 issues, and never lost that excitement and that thrill. I loved writing those characters. I had some more stuff I wanted to do, but it was a good time to leave schedule wise. I needed the room in my schedule for that other stuff I got coming up. It was a good time to step away, and Kieran, is taking over, and he's the perfect guy to take over because he's been doing Star Wars stuff now as long as I have. He and I stood next to each other in the warehouse at the Skywalker Ranch, looking at lightsabers and ooh and on over Yoda puppets and boxes full of blasters. And one point I was like, "What is that over there something on the floor, like under that shelf?" We go look and it's Han Solo frozen in carbonite, like lying on the floor. So we were both like kids back then. I think we've had both had that same excitement the whole time. So I'm excited to see what Kieran is going to do now.
So, a quick question. This one is from JR. What he's interested in finding out is how hard is it to be able to write Star Wars with the movies coming out, with Disney having books? I mean, how much are there characters you're not allowed to touch? Do you have to get permission to create new characters like Han's, wife, or is it because it's the comic books they're a little more hands off?
Well, I mean, everything runs through Lucasfilm. They have a Lucasfilm story group, so they're involved in everything. Movies, cartoons, books, comics, all that stuff. It's their job to make sure everything fits together in some way. So yeah, they were always very involved. We'd go out there a few times and have meetings, or you just get notes back on everything. So yes, there would be characters um, things you weren't allowed to use or reference or play with. I could generally tell, like when there was a movie coming up that they hadn't announced yet, when they would tell me, "Well, you can't use that guy." So I'd be like, oh, "Okay, well, I know what that means." But yeah, I mean, for the most part, I got to do what I wanted to do. If anything, I was surprised at the big moments we were able to do. Kind of right out of the gate, we put Luke and Darth Vader face to face, and we had Luke fight Boba Fett. We did the moment where Vader hears the word Skywalker for the first time in relation to Luke. So we always kind of grabbed, and Kieran and I both, we grabbed for the biggest moments we could to make those books feel weighty and important.
Well, no, yeah, you guys have been able to do quite a bit of things. All of the books I've seen, even just little things, like you mentioned with the Skywalker, little ties to bring it all together. So, okay, so well, let's move on to the most important stuff. Let's talk about your independent stuff that you're working on right now over at Image Comics. We've
It's
got,
all important to me, so
and
it's
you
okay.
you did say they were all your babies,
Right.
but you've currently Goddamned is coming back.
I've got a giant
Um,
Thor hammer on my desk. Really simple.
and Southern Bastards is continuing. Let's talk about Goddamn first. When are we getting another book of that?
It's. I mean, we're working on it. It's kind of, we're just waiting until we've got enough in the can before we solicit anything. So we'll see.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, that's the next volume is in the works. It's something very different from the first book. Different cast of characters. Um, Everything about it looks different. Still the same beautiful Guerra artwork. It's called The Virgin Bride. So I'm excited for people to see it. Um, just can't say yet when we'll be soliciting it. But the
Okay.
brand new hardcover edition, big oversized, beautiful hardcover edition of the first art comes out tomorrow, right?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes, I love those Image hardcover editions. They are absolutely beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, and Guerra, pours his heart into those pages. So I like we all like the idea of doing them in a bigger size. It looks, he's Serbian and lives in Barcelona, so this looks like a very European edition. Like those big French graphic novels that you see over there.
Oh, there
Did I
we
lose
go.
you? No.
Nope, we're good. So that one's coming back at some point. But we're wrapping this up, and there's just so much to talk about. I want to get to Southern Bastards. Southern Bastards. When I read the first issue, I enjoyed it, and then we got to the end, and I was like, okay, this is going to be something special. But that first story arc, when I've gotten people to pick up the first trade, when they've come back to me after the reveal at the end that you have then teased us with the entire time after that,
Right.
I knew that this book was going to be something special. Like it has been so much fun to read, and it is so well done. And there are so many people in that story that I hate, like almost everybody. Where did this inspiration come from? Because it's so well written, the dialogue, the small town feel. Where's the inspiration for this book?
Growing up in Alabama, growing up in the South, loving football. And then when I first started thinking about doing something at Image, I mean, to me, the big difference in doing work for hire stuff and creator owned stuff, it's not my level of investment. Again, like I said, I'm invested in all this stuff, whether I made up Thor or not. If I'm sitting down to write it, I feel very invested. To me, it's about the relationships with the people we are collaborating with. So, with Marvel, the good and bad thing is that I work with people who are, artists who live all over the world. So I get to work with literally some of the most amazing artists on the planet. The downside of that is I'm working with people maybe never going to meet face to face, never talk to, maybe at most exchange some emails with. So when it comes to creator on stuff, to me, it starts with that relationship. And then I want to work with somebody that I know, somebody that I already have that connection with. So when I first started talking to Image, I started talking to Jason Latour, and he and I had done little things together over the years. And we kind of talked before about doing a bigger thing together. We're both Southerners. We're both football fans, which, if anything, we bonded over that. I mean, I could tell you, I think I could probably name every person in comics who's a football fan because we all somehow find each other and talk football. So it kind of started from that. I had a kernel of an idea for a bad guy, which actually came from Scalped. The idea of a high school football coach as a crime boss was something I toyed with doing in Scalped and then didn't. So I had that idea. I had a title, Southern Bastards. I knew I wanted to do sort of Southern crime thing, and then Latour and I put it together, between the two of us. But it was really that relationship was the most important part of it. And that's kind of the same way with all the creator-owned stuff I've done. I think you're kind of starting a small business together with that person. So, you want it to be somebody that you feel pretty tight with.
That's fair. So, how many issues do you think we're going to get overall with Southern Bastards?
We haven't really said. We've got two more issues to finish up this arc, the fourth volume. Um, I don't like to I didn't want to put an number on it because then you feel kind of beholden to that. So I think again, we've always known where we're headed. We talked about the ending, right from the get go. So you still just kind of feel your way along, and I don't know. I still don't want to put an issue number on it. I don't think we're talking about 60 issues like with Scalped. But does that mean 30? Does that mean 40? I don't know. I think we'll know when we get there.
Okay, are we going to be getting some payoff with his daughter here soon?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've started to get this arc, right? Like
We have, yes.
for the first time, Roberta's there. She's got boots on the ground. In this most recent issue that Latour wrote, you saw her start to get involved with what's going on. So yes, that goes up a notch in these last two issues.
Excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. So we're winding down here, Jason. Thank you for joining us. I just want to ask you one more question. Is there any piece of advice that you can give to people who want to be in the industry, people who want to write, just something that that they can take from you that can give them a little motivation?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I talked about in terms of breaking in and pitching to editors, I think you always want to be polite and persistent, but not a pain in the butt, because their editors, at least all the ones I know, are all so busy. And the other thing for me was just kind of looking at things as a reader, looking at what I wanted to read. So I started doing a war comic. That was, the other side was the first thing I did, which didn't really sell great, but I did a war comic that I wanted to read. Scalped was the same sort of thing. Nobody was begging for a Native American crime drama, but I could look at it and say, honestly, well, if I saw that on the shelf, I'd pay my $3 to read it. Southern Bastards the same way. So I think find those stories that you want to read, and do it to the point where you yourself would pay money to read it. I think if you can say that, if you're a good, you got, to me, that's the root of the job. Is I'm doing stuff. It's a very selfish job, right? Like I sit here by myself. Like none of the rest of you people are here in my office when I'm working. I don't see you except when I go to cons. Everything I do is me sitting here coming up with stories that I want to read, that I want to see. The awesome part is I get to send them off into the ether, and all these amazing artists and colorists and letterers and editors, everybody make them happen and put them together. But ultimately it starts with me doing stuff to please myself. It's a very selfish job. So I think if anything, you've got to be a good reader as much as a good writer. And hopefully you like to read cool stuff. And that's the stuff that you'll make for yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. It was great talking to you. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy writing schedule to come down here and talk to us, answer some questions from your fans. And we'll be looking forward to the next goddamn coming up. Of course, what you have for Thor, and for me, most importantly, the next two issues of Southern Bastards.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Have a great night, and thank you, everybody, for watching. Go check out our other Google Hangout interviews. We've got Kelly Sue on there. We've got Rick Remender, a few others, Brian Michael Bendis. Just go and take a peek. It's always fun. If you want to see somebody that I haven't talked to or that I have maybe not thought about talking to, shoot me a message, and I'll send them an email. Thank you very much, and have a great night.